Genesis chapter 11. We're going to be in chapter 11 tonight. Genesis chapter 11. Somebody tell me about some of the things we talked about last week, if you remember. What did we talk about?
I think there was a lot of begets.
Yeah, chapter 10. We were in chapter 10, right? Chapter 10 had a lot of the, this one begat that one, and all of those kind of things. Talked a bit about that. Yeah, that's going to come up again tonight. We're going to talk about that. Go ahead, Paul.
We talked about the curse of Canaan and the fact that a lot of people call it the curse of Ham, but
yeah,
it's that's not in there.
Right. Absolutely, it's not in there. Kind of the practical application for us, the take home for us. What was one of the things that we saw from the line of Ham? What was the line of Ham? What did they tend to be? What nations and what's that?
Oh, I was going to say evil.
Well, that's it. Yeah, they were evil, right? You got Egypt, you got Babylon, you got all that kind of stuff. So they tended to be evil, and so the takeaway was what? What did we say we can learn from that?
To be good.
Yeah, that's true. And what impact does that have?
It's the example that you set, so it goes generation, generation, generation.
That's right. Children, not always, but often will follow in the footsteps of their parents. And if it's a wicked example, they often, we can see biblically, they often end up worse. And that's kind of what's happening with Ham and his lineage and all of that. So that's a sobering thought for us to contemplate, to think about. Whether or not your children are grown, whether or not your grandchildren are grown, whether or not you have children at all, you're an example. You're in the body of Christ, so you're an example to every other child and grandchild and every other individual around you. You have an impact. I see you. I watch you. I see how you act. You see how I act, right? So we are examples to one another, and we're examples to that next generation. So that's something that should be in our minds as a sober thought. We want to be good, godly examples so that the next generation will be better than us, right? No? We want the next generation to be more godly, right? We want them to love God even more than we do. So we want to set out those good, godly examples. We don't want them to be worse. So our examples, the way we live, has an impact on other people. We need to think seriously about that. The way you live your life is an example to someone else. And we want to be good, godly examples. So, I think that's pretty much what we talked about. I know we went off on some other things, but unless somebody has something they absolutely want to bring back up from last week, yeah?
Not from last week, but I was just sitting here thinking about, Abraham. Well, Abraham had two sons.
Mm-hmm.
One of them followed Abraham. The other one followed his own way. And then we have Jacob and Esau, who were brothers and twins.
Yeah.
One of them followed God, the other one followed the other way. And we're dealing with the descendants of both Ishmael and Esau today in the United States, in the Muslim world, because that's where they come from.
Mm-hmm. Yep, the Muslims and the Jewish people, right? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. People ultimately have choice, freedom of choice. They can go their own way, but we want to make sure we're those examples for people. All right, let's look at Genesis chapter 11. We'll read verses 1 through 9. I'll take a volunteer, somebody who wants to read Genesis chapter 11, 1 through 9. Yes?
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth.
All right, thank you. All right, so what does verse 1 state? What's it?
Language.
It's one language. What does that mean? What does that mean? They had one language. We kind of know what that means, but what does that imply? There's one
all
language.
able to communicate with each other and understand.
Absolutely. So they're all able to communicate with one another. They all spoke English. Some people say they all spoke. Some people say they all spoke Hebrew. Pick your favorite language. Maybe that's what it was. They had one language. That means that they were. It's a U word. They were united. There's a unity that goes along with that, right? Is unity a good thing or a bad thing?
Normally good.
Good
Yeah.
things is for good things.
Almost neutral. It's an almost neutral kind of idea. We think, a lot of times I think we think about unity as a good thing. United in our one effort to beat cancer or drugs or whatever. We have this one united kind of goal. We think of it that way. But it may not always, and we're going to see, it may not always be a good thing. Depends on what we're united in, what we're united for, what is our common purpose and our common goal. But they're united. So that's the first thing that we see there. They're united. In verse 2, it says that they migrated east. Here's what we explored before. Let's talk about it again. What is the symbolism behind moving east biblically?
Away from God.
Away from God. Now, is that always the case?
No.
It's not. It's not a blanket statement. You'll find times in the scriptures where it doesn't have that symbolic meaning. But here, they're moving. Now, some translations will say they headed out of the east or something like that. I think the best rendering is that they journeyed eastward or they journeyed in the east, something along those lines. So they're traveling. They're one people because they're unified here, and they're traveling eastward. Again, eastward has that idea of moving away from God. If a person biblically travels westward, often it symbolizes what? Toward God, right? So they're opposites. What examples can you think of that would illustrate this principle? Abraham. Abraham goes from where to where? Which is? It's in the east. The Chaldeans, it's Babylon area, right? It's in the east. God calls him out of the and he heads west. Somebody said, was it last week? That's why we moved here. We moved from the east to the west. We're getting closer to God. I don't know if we have to keep moving. What's another? That's a great example. That's a great example because God calls a man out of the east to the west, calls him to himself, calls him to be the father of the faithful, the father of the nation, all of that kind of thing. So that's a great example. What are some other examples about this east-west symbolism that we can see in the scriptures?
Didn't the wise men come from the east?
Yes, the wise men came from the east, and they were seeking Jesus. They were seeking the Messiah. They were seeking the King. So they come from the east, and they travel west, and they end up finding that long-awaited one. They're traveling towards God. Now we know that they go home, but so they're you know, we wouldn't put any kind of symbolism behind their going back home. They went back home for whatever reason. But they're traveling westward, and they come from the east to find the Messiah, the Christ. What else? Can anybody think of any others?
When the Israelites were heading into the Promised Land, even though they wandered around the desert for a while, ultimately in the end they went into the Promised Land from the east.
Right, yeah. I hadn't even thought of that. That's right, because they come on that outside, they're on the east side, and they come in, absolutely. They enter the Promised Land from that way. It's a great point. What else in Israel's history as a nation points us to this? It's on your tongue, I know it.
When they fled Egypt.
When they fled Egypt, well, when they fled Egypt, that's what Marsha was saying, they eventually come around in there. I'm thinking about they're in the land, they're the people of God, they're in the land, they're worshiping God, but God made a couple, he made a covenant with them, the covenant of blessing and cursing. He said, if you follow me, you obey my laws and statutes, the land will bud and blossom, it'll be fruitful, you'll have lots of children, and you know, all of that kind of stuff. But if you fall away, if you rebel against me, the land will, anybody remember, it's kind of a graphic picture, the land will, the land will vomit you out. And one of the deportations, one of the places they go is to Babylon. Back over where back over in that area, they go east again. Now when they repent, when the period of that exile has happened, they come back eastward. So again, we can see that symbolism. They rebel against God, they're physically moved away, and they go east. When they repent and the time has come, they're going to come back, be gathered together, and they come westward again. Another
James, I had a question.
Yes.
In Job 1:3, it says that that Job was the greatest of all the people of the East. Is there any significance about Job being the greatest man in all the East that you?
Well, there could be something there. Job is believed to be the earliest writing, earlier than Genesis, because Genesis is written by Moses. He is believed to be earlier or a contemporary with Abram. So they would be in the east. He's probably earlier than Abraham, right? So he is a righteous man among wicked people, right? We're going to see that this land is a wicked land. So there may be some significance there. Here is, and I hadn't thought about this before, it'd be something to think about, right? I'm not saying this is factual. This might be something for you to go away and study. It may be that he is very similar to Noah. Noah was righteous in all his generation, right? He was in a wicked world. The whole world was wicked, and yet he was righteous. It may very well be that Job is in this wicked area, wicked, ungodly people, and he's maybe the only righteous one at that point. So there could be something significant in there, absolutely. Something maybe to further delve into and think about. Yeah, could be something really good there. One that I thought about was in Genesis chapter 4:16. Genesis chapter 4, verse 16. What's that say? Somebody read that.
Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden.
Away from the presence of the Lord. And there again, he's moving east, away. So, again, it's not always, but we can see this, we can see it quite a bit. There's some kind of a pattern here. So, we always want to be moving in which direction Symbolically. We want to move west, right? What would the settlers in America say? You know, like, westward, go westward, young man, go westward. Yeah, we want to go west. We always want to be drawing closer to God and not further away from God. They had a physical geography that symbolized that. We don't have a physical geography that symbolizes that, but spiritually we can be walking either towards God or away. Looks like you have something to say.
It's interesting too, though, if you look at the whole world, you think of the East, China, and
Yeah.
those countries that are not godly.
Yeah, somebody brought that up last week. Was it you, Mike? Did you bring that up? Yeah, definitely, again, one of these things to think about, because we often think of the East as, dark, mysterious. There's a lot of interesting religious paganism kind of practices and things of that nature. So, yeah, there could be something there as well. I'm not sure, but it's something to contemplate. And as Mike had kind of pointed out early on, the gospel moved westward. Yeah, moved westward, at least initially anyways. So something to think about. I'd be marking this kind of thing down. And as I'm reading through the scriptures, as you're reading through the scriptures, be noting these kind of things. This should pop back up to you. And you should ask yourself a question. If somebody's moving in a direction and you're given east or west, you might want to stop and say, is this one of those passages that has some symbolic meaning behind it? And kind of examine that. So you should be thinking about these things as we go through. Remember, Genesis is the book of foundation, foundational book. We're going to read this, study this, understand this, so that as we continue to read through the Old Testament, as we continue to read through the New Testament, we're going to have a better and a greater appreciation. We're going to understand the Bible better because we've studied Genesis. Is that right? Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So think about those things. Does anybody know, well, what land do they settle in chapter 11? What land do they settle in? Verse 2.
Shinar?
Yeah, Shinar or Shinar. Yeah, the land of Shinar. Does anybody know what that land is? What does that land become? Yeah, becomes Babylon. We won't go there, but if you're taking notes, you might want to cross-reference Daniel chapter 1, verse 2. Daniel chapter 1, verse 2 talks about Shinar or Shinar as well. So there's going to be your cross-reference. So this is Babylon. Now, if we're thinking, again, symbolically for the moment, what does Babylon often represent? Evil. Yes, as well as what else?
Power, wealth.
It's power, it's wealth, corruption, idolatry. Yes, idolatry, right? Pagan idolatry. It also represents captivity and suffering. Israel goes off to captivity into Babylon, at least one of the captivities. They also go, there's the Assyrian captivity and all that, but for the moment, we're thinking about that Babylonian captivity. So it's suffering, it's idolatry, it's all of that kind of stuff that's in there. So these people are moving eastward, they're moving away from God, and they settle basically in Babylon. In Revelation, it talks about the whore of Babylon. It talks about, come out of her, my people. This kind of idea. These people are going into Babylon, and they're going to settle there, or at least that's what the place is going to become. So what does this text tell us just in symbol, just in symbolic kind of meanings? What are some of the things it says? What do we know about these people? We've already said it. I want to restate it. What
They're sticking together.
They're unified, right? We talked about that. There's a unity, so they're sticking together. They're unified. They're unified in their moving away from God. They're unified in their moving away from God, and they're going to settle together in this land of suffering, idolatry, this symbolic kind of land here. What's going on in verse 3? Look at verse 3. What's going on there? What's the text say?
They were making bricks.
Yeah, they were making brick. Now, this seems to be a new technology. Prior to this, people made things with rocks. They would build their houses and all that kind of stuff with big boulders and rocks and that kind of thing. Here seems to be maybe a new technology is being invented, and they're going to bake bricks. And that's probably because if you go into that area, they don't have big stones and rocks and all that kind of stuff. So if you've got a new technology, what happens often when there's a new technology invented?
Replaces God.
Can replace God. Absolutely. Can become an idol.
They wanted to make a name for themselves.
Yeah, right. We're going to talk about that. They wanted to make a name for themselves, right? So they're using this new technology. What else comes with new technology? When they split the atom, what happened?
You can bomb people.
Yeah, you weaponize it, right? You've got a new technology, and a lot of times what happens with a new technology is there's a new invention, a new way to do what kind of things though? Destroy, and we call it the S word, sin. There's new ways to sin. The internet, it's a great invention. And a wicked invention, right? I mean, the invention itself is not what's bad. It's a new technology. It's old now, but it's a new technology, and with it came a lot of ungodly things, didn't it? Yeah. I mean, we're plagued with pornography that is rampant. Prior to the internet, it was a whole lot harder to get involved in that kind of stuff. You actually had to go to some pretty seedy places, usually. You had to physically go out and people would see you potentially getting this material. Now it's right on your phone. It's streamed. So with new technology, a lot of times what humans tend to do is now there's something new. There's a great new way to sin. There's a great new way to become a rebel against God. Idolatry and all that kind of stuff. So
also
yes.
There's a great way to use it if it's used properly.
That's right.
you can preach to billions at one time.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's a mixed bag. But quite often new technology also brings new ways to sin, new inventions of sinning. But you're right. You're right. There is a balance there. You're able to do things with the internet. Oh, we've talked about it tonight. We're recording stuff here. If you missed this week, eventually James will get it up on the internet and you'll be able to listen to it. So you're right. You're right. It can be a mixed bag. Be a mixed bag.
It seems like the more you get, the more you want, or the better it is, the more you they found this better way to build stuff, and now we can have all these big, and I mean, it's like that today. The more you get, the bigger and better you want. Right. The bigger sinners we can become, because that's what that is. If I become consumed with stuff, what am I biblically? I'm an idolater, right? And that's what we're going to see. These people become idolaters. So the new technology, people use it to do what? Verse 4, what do they do with this new technology? This new technology that could be used to honor God, to worship Him, to praise Him. What do they do with this new technology?
Build themselves.
Try to make themselves
build us a city for ourselves.
Pride.
It's pride.
Equal themselves.
Yeah, there's arrogance. They're equal. They want to build a city, and they want to build a temple. This probably was a ziggurat. Ziggurats, everybody know what that is? No. Ziggurat's kind of like a pyramid. You've seen the pyramids all around the world, right? In Egypt, but you also have those similar kind of structures in Mesopotamia and down in South America and that kind of stuff. Mayan temples, that's a ziggurat. The pyramids, absolutely. That's kind of the structure. What, does anybody know what they're used for? Well, what the ziggurat was used for?
Worship.
It's worship. It's a temple. It's a worship. It's a place to worship and honor. And who are these guys worshiping?
Themselves. Let's make a name for ourselves.
Yeah. So they're worshiping themselves. They stay together.
They were making, they had gotten to where they could make a lot of fire. I mean, it took a lot of heat to go from primitive to make, I mean.
They probably would have been baking a lot of those bricks
And in
the sun as well and stuff.
You had that terrible furnace in Babylon that,
Yeah, yeah, right.
you know, that burned up the men that tried to kill the, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting the excuse or the reasoning they have for doing it. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth.
Yes, yes.
To me, that's false reasoning. But
Well, let's talk about that. It was a little further down, but we'll talk about it.
Would like some water.
What was God's command to the people, to Noah, his family, when they came off the ark? It was a similar command he gave to Adam and Eve. What was the command that?
Replenish the earth.
Yeah, fill the earth,
so forth and multiply.
spread out. And these guys say,
Stay together.
no way, we're going to stay together. No way. So what are they doing? By staying together, what are they doing?
Disobeying God.
They're disobeying. They're sinning. They're in rebellion to God. Open rebellion. So what are they united in? Sin. They're united in sin. They're united in their rebellion against God. We will not do as God has commanded us. Was it a difficult command? Seems pretty simple, right? I mean, something that might be going on there. Text doesn't tell us, but there might be fear. There might be fear. Fear of the unknown. You ever get afraid of the unknown?
Yes.
Fear of the future? Those kind. That could be something that's going on there. But fear, if that's what's going on, it's fear that's unreasonable, and it's causing them to rebel against God. Regardless of whatever the reason is for them not wanting to go out, they're in rebellion. Direct rebellion to the command of God. Can we learn something from that? What can we learn?
Well, we're told to go to all the world and preach the gospel, that's for sure.
Yes.
And sometimes it's really easy to stay put. I mean, it's comfortable to stay at home.
Absolutely. Is it easy to go out and tell people about Christ? For some it may be, but for a lot of people it's not. Is there ever fear? You ever afraid you might lose a friendship? People might think you're a Jesus freak, a nut job, lose my job, lose anything like that, right?
I think about that all the time when somebody's in pain or, hurting, and I want to say I'll pray for you, but I know that person is not in that, and it just,
That doesn't matter to them.
yeah.
Yeah,
Sometimes they take like offense to it.
yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a fear. I mean, I'm kind of past that. I guess I'm old enough that if I lose friends, I lose. It's as you get older, I think you age out of some of that.
Mhm.
I think there's a fear of not really knowing what if I don't say the right thing. What if they ask me something that I don't really know how to answer?
Right, right. Yeah, there can be fear for all different reasons. I don't know how to answer. I don't know how to respond. They might make fun of me. They might not like me. They won't invite me to their barbecue. Whatever it is, that there can be fear of all kinds of things. If these guys are fearing, it puts them at odds with a command from God. We don't want to allow fear to keep us from obeying God's commands. We don't want fear to keep us and to put us in open rebellion to God. These people are in open rebellion to God. They will not go. So God is not pleased with that. So there's a couple sins that they commit. One of them is they won't settle. They won't spread out. They're going to settle together. They're going to stay unified as one people. That's a sin. They sin against God. Another one is pride and arrogance and idolatry and some of those things that we've talked about already. So there's multiple sins that are going on here. And if you just read the text once through, you might not pick that up. You might miss some of that. But did anybody notice what they say specifically? Somebody read verses 3 and 4 and listen to what they say.
And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth.
All right, so you heard them say, let us make, let us build. Does that echo anything that we've already looked at?
Yeah, the creation.
Yeah. Who says those similar words? God does. God says, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. So what is humanity here doing?
Taking place of God.
Well, they're going to take place of God. That's true.
In their minds.
Sure. They're in some ways trying to be creative, reflecting God's glory in some sense. Now they're doing it for wicked reasons and purposes. But they're imitating God is not a bad thing. In fact, we should be imitating God, right? What's that?
Be followers of me as I am of Christ.
That's right.
It's to look at your motives.
Absolutely. What are we doing? Are we trying to replace God? Are we trying to usurp his authority? They're doing that. They're imitating God. They're acting out one of God's characteristics. Part of his nature is to create, and man ought to reflect that character. But they're doing it with wicked, evil, sinful motives. You got it? Yeah, all right. That's what I thought. He knows it. So they're doing it with wicked intent. They're sinning against God. But it's interesting that they say, let us. And it's mirroring that text in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. If you paint, if you create something beautiful on a canvas, that's a characteristic of God. You're imitating him in some form. He's the great artist, isn't he? You ever look at a sunset or a sunrise or a flower or a bee or, anything, right? Even if you don't like bees. Just look at, tonight when you walk outside, if it's a clear sky, look up. Look at the painting, right? So if you paint anything, that's a reflection of God's character in some form. You're imitating God. Now, can we use that for good or for evil? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We can make a wonderful painting that glorifies God, and we are reflecting him and we're praising him with it. But we can also make some paintings that do the opposite. They either glorify ourselves or they sin in some other way. If you create beautiful music, if you're able to play an instrument or something like that, you can play that instrument for God. You can make wonderful music for the Lord, or you can make it for yourself. You can make a name for yourself. You can make that in idol worship. Yeah. So all of those things, we want to make sure that whatever we do, right? Whatever you do in word or deed, do all for the glory of God. Do all in the name of Christ. Anything that you do it, work at it hard. But make sure that it's he who is number one. Make sure that you're glorifying him. And you can't glorify him if you're creating something that's wicked in and of itself. That doesn't glorify God in any way. So they're rebelling. They're usurping God's kind of authority as they're making this. They're making themselves, putting themselves in that place of God. The temple that they built is a temple to worship themselves. Let us make a name for ourselves. And they're unified in their sin and their rebellion. What does God do in order to get the people to obey his command and scatter?
Verse 7. Let us go down and confuse their language.
Yeah, it confuses the languages. Let us go down, let us confuse the languages. So he creates new languages. They had one language, they were unified. That could have been a good thing, but they used it for evil. The new technology could have been a good thing, but they used it for evil. They're just... You had Noah and his family, righteous, holy, they come through the flood, all of that, and then it goes down the tubes again, doesn't it? And it starts with Noah. It's interesting. Gets off the boat and he's the first one to sin. And then it just follows after. And so they're unified in all of that kind of thing. So God confuses the language. He creates new languages. If you can't communicate with each other, what happens?
Confusion.
There's confusion. You don't get along. What's that? Yeah, you can't get along. There's confusion. You tend to go with people of your own kind, right? You go with the people you can communicate with. And that's what happens. So here is where we get the different groups. Sometimes people call them races. The Irish race, the Hispanic race, whatever. They're just different people groups. But this is the beginning of why we have different groups. Because what happens if you take a dog and you take it and you separate it and you just have certain traits in this one kind of dog over here? What happens? Let's say it's short. Just you're breeding out for short dogs.
You're going to get short dogs.
You're going to get short dogs. And then over here you're going to breed out for dogs that are tall, large. You're going to get that. That's what happens. That's where the different groups come from. This is the beginnings of it. So if you wanted to know where did all the different races, and I think that's a bad term, but if you want to know where all the different groups come from, it's here. It's a consequence of sin. Right? The consequence of sin is that there's a division now in humanity. And so they go all out over the place. And what happens is you've got different pockets, different pools, different gene pools that are only interbreeding. I only know this language, I'm with these people. They don't, you know. So you get these groups that separate, and so you'll get the different gene pools that will only pretty much produce whatever that group is. That makes sense? That's a little bit of kind of the science behind why we have these different groups and different peoples. But ultimately, it's a result of sin. It wasn't meant to be that way to begin with. But there's this separation that happens.
Man became real tribal, too.
Sure, absolutely.
You know, Elaine did a study of the Hogan name. She couldn't find one for DeVore when she was going to Cape, and the Hogan name comes from the land of Little Og, and Og is king of Bashan, and he's in the Bible, and he's not good. So, you know, my conclusion was that Irish clan, the land of Little Og, from Og, king of Bashan, that would be that Gentile dispersion, you know, that was really interesting to me.
Sure.
The root name of Hogan, but,
sure.
You know.
But you're right, there's the beginnings of tribalism.
Yeah, I'd rather have Paul's name, Kirk, which means church. But so,
Mike's got a bad name, sour name there.
But I mean, you know, that's where we came from, I guess, you know.
Yes, that's where the different groups come from. That's where the tribalism comes from, and fighting one another and all that. You know, you're different than me, you sound different, and all that kind of stuff. We need to look, I'm not letting it go until we look at Acts chapter 17 for a moment. And then we'll wrap up with this. Acts chapter 17, starting in verse 26. We need to take this to heart. Acts chapter 17, starting in verse 26. And it says this: "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling places, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. But did you notice that he says it's from one man? One man. We talked about this before. One blood. The human family is, we all go back to Adam through Noah. There shouldn't be any racism. There shouldn't be anything like that. And in the church, it certainly ought not to be that way, right? We're one, right? That's what Christ came to do, united. Let me throw this at you, and then we'll wrap up, and maybe we'll talk about it again next week. God confused the languages here in Shinar with the people. That's part of the curse. Can you think of a place where people start hearing in the same language or in their own languages?
Pentecost.
Yes. This should remind you of that, yeah? The mixing of the languages, part of the curse. Man's rebellion, part of the sin, all of that kind of stuff. Acts chapter 2, the people heard the gospel. Everyone heard it in their own language. There is the beginning of the reversal of that curse, all the curses. But there's one. Now, it doesn't last forever there. But it's that glimpse, it's that spark. It's meant to say, yes, and we're looking forward to the day when we will again be united. This time we'll be united in the one blood, the blood of the Savior. We'll be united in Jesus. We're looking forward to that day when we'll speak the same language again. We'll be one, truly one people again. This passage makes us long for Jesus. It should. When you read that, you should automatically have in your notes Acts chapter 2, where they hear the gospel in their own language again. Great thing to put that note on. We can talk about it again next week if you want to. We're out of time, but any last quick thoughts, comments, concerns? If not, Mike, would you mind closing us?